What happens when a lonely elderly woman witnesses a neighborhood fire? Flames rise, smoke fills the air, fear grips the community. But then, something incredible happens on the rooftop. Bruce Springsteen appears, singing with a voice that cuts through chaos. His music becomes a beacon of hope in the darkness. The elderly woman watches in amazement as Bruce Springsteen transforms tragedy into triumph. Sometimes heroes appear in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes salvation comes through song. When the community needs it most, Bruce Springsteen saves the day from above. Music has the power to heal, to unite, to rescue. This is a story about courage, compassion, and the magic that happens when someone refuses to stand by and do nothing. Get ready for a journey that will restore your faith in human kindness. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street, illuminating the worn brick facades of houses that had stood for nearly a century. Each home told a story of families raised, dreams pursued, and lives lived with quiet dignity. At the end of the street, in a small white house with blue shutters and a garden overflowing with autumn chrysanthemums, lived Eleanor Mitchell, 83 years old and keeper of the neighborhood's unofficial memory. Eleanor had called this street home for 57 years, had watched children grow into adults, had witnessed marriages and divorces, births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows. Her husband, Robert, had passed 5 years ago, leaving behind a silence that filled every corner of their small home. Their children lived in distant cities, busy with careers and families of their own, calling every Sunday, but visiting only on holidays. On this particular Tuesday morning, Eleanor sat in her favorite armchair by the living room window, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands as she watched the familiar rhythms of her neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson walked her golden retriever past the mailbox at precisely 8:15, just as she had every morning for the past decade. The mail carrier, a young man named David who always waved and asked about her roses, would arrive at 10:30 with letters that were mostly bills and advertisements. The routine comforted Eleanor, providing structure to days that might otherwise feel empty and purposeless. She had learned to find meaning in small observations, to create connection through witness, even when direct interaction seemed increasingly rare. As she watched the street, Eleanor noticed a man walking slowly along the sidewalk, his hands in his pockets and his head down as if lost in thought. There was something familiar about his posture, something that reminded her of her late husband during his contemplative moods. The stranger was probably in his 70s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors, years filled with both joy and sorrow. Bruce Springsteen had been driving through small New Jersey towns for hours, seeking the kind of solitude and reflection that only came from anonymous wandering. Sometimes the weight of fame and expectation required escape, demanded the simple pleasure of being just another person walking down an ordinary street in an unremarkable neighborhood. He had parked his car several blocks away and was now walking without destination, letting his feet carry him wherever they chose. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the quiet suburban street felt like a refuge from the demands of his public life. As Bruce passed the white house with blue shutters, he glanced toward the window and noticed an elderly woman watching the street with the kind of attention that suggested both loneliness and curiosity. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she offered a small wave that he returned with a gentle nod and smile. Eleanor felt a flutter of pleasure at the brief interaction. It had been days since she'd spoken to another human being beyond the necessary exchanges with grocery clerks and pharmacy workers. The stranger's smile carried genuine warmth, the kind of automatic kindness that some people possessed naturally. Bruce continued his walk, turning left at the corner and disappearing from Eleanor's view. She returned to her tea and her quiet observations, but something about the encounter stayed with her. Perhaps it was the way he had acknowledged her presence without pity or dismissal, treating her wave as worthy of response rather than something to be ignored. 20 minutes later, Eleanor's peaceful morning was shattered by the sound of sirens approaching rapidly. She rose from her chair and moved to the window, her heart beginning to race with the kind of anxiety that came too easily at her age. 3 fire trucks rounded the corner at high speed, their lights flashing and horns blaring as they navigated the narrow street. The trucks stopped directly across from Eleanor's house, their crews jumping out with practiced efficiency and urgency. Eleanor watched in growing horror as she realized the source of their attention, the Patterson house, where Mrs. Patterson and her golden retriever lived alone, was filling with smoke that poured from the kitchen windows. Within minutes, the quiet street had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Firefighters connected hoses to hydrants, paramedics set up triage areas, and police officers began directing traffic and keeping curious neighbors at a safe distance. Eleanor pressed her face to the window, desperate to understand what was happening to her long-time neighbor. Through the smoke and confusion, she could see Mrs. Patterson standing on the sidewalk in her nightgown and slippers, holding her frightened dog and speaking rapidly to a paramedic. The woman looked older and more fragile than Eleanor had ever noticed, vulnerable in a way that made Eleanor's heart ache with recognition and sympathy. The fire appeared to be contained to the kitchen, but smoke continued to pour from the house, and Eleanor could see firefighters moving through the interior with their oxygen tanks and protective gear. The damage might not be catastrophic, but she knew that for an elderly woman living alone, even minor disaster could feel overwhelming and isolating. As Eleanor watched the scene unfold, she noticed the same man from earlier standing at the edge of the crowd that had gathered to observe the emergency response. He was no longer walking aimlessly, but instead seemed focused on the situation, his attention shifting between Mrs. Patterson and the firefighters working to assess the damage. Bruce had heard the sirens from several blocks away and had followed the sound back toward Maple Street, driven by the same curiosity and concern that drew people toward emergency situations. But as he observed the scene, he found himself particularly focused on the elderly woman who stood holding her dog, looking lost and overwhelmed by the sudden disruption to her orderly life. The fire chief emerged from the house and approached Mrs. Patterson with the kind of gentle authority that experienced emergency responders used with vulnerable citizens. Eleanor watched as he explained something to her neighbor, his gestures suggesting that while the immediate danger had passed, the house would be uninhabitable until repairs could be completed. Eleanor saw Mrs. Patterson's shoulders sag with this news, watched as the woman looked around at the crowd of neighbors and emergency workers with the expression of someone who suddenly realized she had no one to call for help. Her children lived in other states. Her husband had died years ago, and her social connections were limited to brief encounters with neighbors and service workers. Without fully understanding why, Eleanor found herself opening her front door and walking across the street toward the crowd. She moved slowly, her arthritis making rapid movement impossible, but with determination born from recognition of another person's need. "Margaret," she called, as she approached Mrs. Patterson, using her neighbor's first name for perhaps the first time in decades of acquaintance. "Margaret, are you all right?" Mrs. Patterson turned toward Eleanor's voice, and the relief in her eyes was immediately apparent. Here was someone familiar, someone who understood the rhythms and relationships of their small community. "Eleanor," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shaking slightly, "they say I can't stay in the house tonight. The smoke damage is too extensive, and they need to check for electrical problems. I don't know where I'm going to go." Bruce watched this exchange from his position at the edge of the crowd, struck by the way crisis could reveal both vulnerability and connection. The 2 elderly women who had lived across from each other for years, with only polite distance between them, were now reaching toward each other with genuine concern and support. "You'll stay with me," Eleanor said without hesitation. "We'll figure out whatever needs to be figured out, but you won't be alone tonight." The simplicity and immediacy of Eleanor's offer seemed to surprise both women. Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to squeeze Eleanor's hand with gratitude that went beyond words. Bruce felt something shift in his chest as he witnessed this moment of spontaneous generosity. Here were two women, both facing the challenges of aging and isolation, choosing to support each other rather than retreat into separate struggles. Their connection embodied everything he had tried to capture in songs about community and mutual aid, but seeing it in real time felt more powerful than any lyrics he had ever written. As the emergency crews began to pack up their equipment and the crowd of neighbors started to disperse, Bruce found himself approaching the two women. He wasn't sure what he intended to say or do, but something about their situation demanded more than passive observation. "Excuse me," he said quietly, addressing both women with the kind of respectful attention he would want someone to show his own mother. "I couldn't help but overhear about the house situation. Is there anything I can do to help?" Eleanor and Mrs. Patterson looked at him with surprise and curiosity. They recognized him as the man who had been walking through the neighborhood earlier, but his offer of assistance seemed unexpected and almost too generous to accept. "That's very kind of you," Eleanor replied, "but we don't want to impose on a stranger. Sometimes strangers are exactly what a situation requires," Bruce said gently. "I noticed that there might be some insurance issues to deal with, temporary housing to arrange, belongings to recover. Those kinds of things can be overwhelming to handle alone." Mrs. Patterson studied his face, noting the sincerity in his expression and the absence of any agenda beyond simple helpfulness. "I'm Margaret Patterson," she said, extending her hand, "and this is Eleanor Mitchell. We're neighbors, though I'm embarrassed to say we don't know each other as well as we should." "I'm Bruce," he replied, accepting her handshake with gentle firmness, "and I have a feeling this situation might be the beginning of knowing each other much better." Over the following hours, Bruce found himself naturally integrated into the practical challenges that followed the fire. He drove Margaret to the insurance office to file initial claims, helped Eleanor prepare her guest room for an extended stay, and made phone calls to contractors who could assess the damage and provide estimates for repairs. But more than his practical assistance, it was his presence that seemed to make the biggest difference. Both women had grown accustomed to handling life's difficulties alone, to making decisions without consultation and facing problems without support. Having someone else share the burden of thinking through options and consequences felt like an unexpected gift. "Bruce?" Eleanor said, as they sat in her living room that evening, Margaret having gone upstairs to rest after the exhausting day. "I have to ask, why are you helping us? We're just two old women you met during a crisis. Most people would have offered sympathy and moved on with their lives." Bruce considered her question carefully, recognizing its importance not just as curiosity, but as a test of his motives and sincerity. "Eleanor, I've spent a lot of years writing songs about community and connection, about how people are supposed to look out for each other, but I realize today that I've been better at singing about those values than living them. When I saw you and Margaret reaching out to each other, I wanted to be part of that kind of genuine caring." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding something essential about the man sitting across from her. "You know, Robert, my husband, used to say that the most important moments in life were the ones when you had to choose between being comfortable and being useful. Today felt like one of those moments." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Margaret coming back downstairs, moving carefully and holding the banister for support. She looked more rested, but also more fragile, as if the day's events had reminded her of her own vulnerability in ways she usually managed to forget. "I've been thinking," Margaret said as she settled into Eleanor's second armchair, "about how quickly everything can change. This morning I was worried about whether my roses needed watering. Tonight I don't even know when I'll see my roses again." "Margaret," Bruce said gently, "tomorrow we'll go look at the house in daylight, see what can be salvaged and what needs to be replaced. But tonight you're safe and you're not alone. Sometimes that has to be enough." As the evening progressed, The three of them fell into comfortable conversation about their lives, their families, their memories of the neighborhood, and how it had changed over the decades. Eleanor shared stories about the different families who had lived in Margaret's house over the years, while Margaret described her late husband's passion for gardening and his dream of creating the perfect backyard sanctuary. Bruce listened more than he spoke, fascinated by the layers of history and connection that existed within this small community. These women had lived parallel lives for years without really knowing each other, sharing the same street but not the deeper experiences that created genuine friendship. "You know what I regret most," Margaret said during a lull in the conversation, "is all the times I wanted to knock on your door, Eleanor, just to have someone to talk with, but I always talked myself out of it, convinced myself that you wouldn't want to be bothered." "I did the same thing," Eleanor admitted, "especially after Robert died. I would see you working in your garden and think about how nice it would be to have coffee together, to share the kinds of conversations that make you feel less alone in the world." Bruce recognized the sadness in both voices, the regret for connections not made, and opportunities for friendship that had been lost to shyness and social convention. "Well," he said quietly, "maybe this fire, as terrible as it was, created the opening you both needed to find each other." The next morning brought new challenges and new discoveries. The fire damage was more extensive than initially apparent, with smoke and water damage affecting most of Margaret's possessions. Her insurance would cover repairs and replacement costs, but the process would take months to complete. As they walked through the damaged house with the insurance adjuster, Bruce watched both women confront the reality of loss and change. Margaret's kitchen, where she had cooked meals for her family for decades, was destroyed. Her dining room, where holiday celebrations had taken place, was smoke-damaged beyond simple cleaning. But Bruce also observed something remarkable happening. Instead of being overwhelmed by the scope of the damage, Margaret seemed to be gaining clarity about what truly mattered to her. As they sorted through belongings, deciding what could be salvaged and what needed to be discarded, she began talking about simplification and new beginnings. "You know," Margaret said as she held a photograph of her late husband that had survived the fire, "maybe this is an opportunity to create something different, something that fits who I am now rather than who I used to be." Eleanor, who had been quietly supportive throughout the morning, looked at her neighbor with new respect. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe I don't need a big house full of furniture I never use and rooms I never enter. Maybe what I need is a smaller space that's easier to maintain, closer to people I care about, more connected to community." Bruce felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the same feeling he got when a song was beginning to form in his mind. These women were talking about more than real estate and insurance claims. They were talking about reimagining their lives in ways that prioritized relationship and meaning over convention and comfort. Over the following days, Bruce found reasons to extend his stay in the neighborhood. He rented a small apartment nearby and became a regular presence in Eleanor's house, helping Margaret navigate insurance procedures while also assisting both women with daily tasks that had become more challenging as they aged. But his most significant contribution was less practical than emotional. His presence seemed to give both women permission to acknowledge needs they had been hiding and to express hopes they had been suppressing. Eleanor admitted that she had been considering selling her large house and moving to a senior community, but had been afraid of seeming helpless or dependent. Margaret revealed that she had been feeling increasingly isolated in her neighborhood, cut off from the kind of community connections that had sustained her throughout her marriage. The fire had been devastating, but it had also created an opportunity to reconsider how and where she wanted to spend her remaining years. "What if," Bruce suggested one evening as they sat on Eleanor's front porch watching the sunset, "you both thought about this as a chance to create the kind of community you actually want to live in?" "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked. "I mean, What if instead of just rebuilding Margaret's house the way it was, you explored other options? What if you thought about ways to live that brought you closer to other people who share your values and interests? The suggestions sparked conversations that continued for weeks. Margaret began researching senior housing communities that emphasized social interaction and mutual support. Eleanor started attending community meetings about aging-in-place programs that could help her maintain independence while staying connected to neighbors. But the more they talked, the more they realized that what they really wanted was something that didn't quite exist yet, a way of living that combined independence with community, privacy with connection, autonomy with mutual support. What we're describing, Margaret said during one of their planning sessions, is the way people used to live when families stayed in the same neighborhoods for generations, when neighbors knew each other well enough to provide real help during difficult times. Bruce nodded, thinking about the communities he had observed throughout his travels, the places where people still looked out for each other as a matter of course rather than exception. Maybe the solution isn't finding the right existing community, but creating the kind of community you want to be part of. This idea took root slowly, growing through weeks of conversation and exploration. Eleanor owned her house outright and had significant equity built up over decades. Margaret's insurance settlement would provide resources for rebuilding or relocating. Together, they began to envision possibilities that neither could achieve alone. What emerged from their planning was both simple and revolutionary. A small, intentional community built around the values of mutual support, shared resources, and meaningful connection. They would renovate Eleanor's property to include a small second dwelling for Margaret, creating separate but connected living spaces that allowed for both privacy and companionship. But more than that, they would design their shared life around the principle of being useful to each other and to their broader community. Eleanor's skills in organization and community history would combine with Margaret's talents in gardening and hospitality to create a household that served as a resource and gathering place for other neighbors. Bruce watched their planning process with admiration and growing inspiration. These two women, faced with crisis and loss, had chosen to respond by creating something better than what they had lost. Their vision embodied everything he believed about the power of community and the importance of caring for each other. As construction began on the property modifications, Bruce found himself thinking about the songs he could write about this experience. But more than that, he began considering how he could use his resources and platform to support similar projects in other communities. The work progressed through autumn and into winter, with Bruce serving as project coordinator and general supporter. He hired contractors, managed timelines, and helped solve the inevitable problems that arose during renovation. But his most important contribution was his belief in what Eleanor and Margaret were creating. Sometimes, he told them during a particularly challenging week when permits were delayed and costs were exceeding budgets, the most important thing you can do for an idea is refuse to let it die when things get difficult. The completed project exceeded everyone's expectations. Eleanor's house had been thoughtfully expanded to include a small apartment with its own entrance, kitchenette, and living space for Margaret. But the real innovation was in the shared spaces, a large kitchen designed for cooperative cooking, a living area that could accommodate community gatherings, and a garden planned to provide food and beauty for the entire neighborhood. The housewarming celebration took place on a warm Saturday evening in late spring, exactly 1 year after the fire that had brought Eleanor and Margaret together. The event drew neighbors from throughout the area, many of whom were meeting each other for the first time, despite living within blocks of each other for years. Bruce provided music for the evening, but he insisted that the focus be on Eleanor and Margaret's achievement rather than on his participation. He performed acoustic versions of songs about community and home, But the most powerful moments came when neighbors shared stories about their own experiences of isolation and their hopes for greater connection. "What Eleanor and Margaret have created here," Bruce said during his brief remarks, "is proof that it's never too late to reimagine how we live, how we care for each other, and how we build the communities we actually want to be part of." The evening concluded with plans for regular community gatherings, shared gardening projects, and informal support systems that would help neighbors assist each other during both routine challenges and emergency situations. The fire that had seemed like pure disaster had become the catalyst for transformation that extended far beyond two individuals. Over the months that followed, Bruce remained connected to Eleanor and Margaret's ongoing project. He visited regularly, sometimes helping with practical tasks, sometimes just enjoying the sense of genuine community they had created. Their home became a model that attracted visitors from other areas interested in creating similar intentional communities. But the most meaningful aspect of the project for Bruce was the way it had changed his understanding of his own role as both artist and citizen. He had always written songs about community and mutual support, but living with Eleanor and Margaret had shown him what those values looked like in daily practice. "Bruce," Eleanor said during one of his visits, as they sat in the garden that Margaret had designed to include vegetables, herbs, and flowers that could be shared with anyone who needed them, "I want to thank you for something that might sound strange." "What's that?" "I want to thank you for treating us like we were worth saving. Not because we were helpless or pitiable, but because we had something valuable to contribute if we were just given the right support and encouragement." Those words stayed with Bruce long after he returned to his regular touring and recording schedule. They reminded him that real community wasn't about rescuing people from their circumstances, but about recognizing the strength and wisdom that everyone possessed and creating conditions where those qualities could flourish. The story of the fire on Maple Street became one that Bruce told often during interviews and concerts, not because it featured his own heroism, but because it illustrated the potential for transformation that existed within ordinary situations when people chose to respond with generosity rather than indifference. Eleanor and Margaret's partnership continued to thrive, drawing visitors and inspiring similar projects throughout the region. Their home became known as a place where people could explore alternatives to isolation and independence that didn't require giving up autonomy or personal choice. Years later, when Bruce was asked about the most meaningful experiences of his career, he always mentioned his time with Eleanor and Margaret. Not because it had produced hit songs or memorable concerts, but because it had taught him that the best art emerged from genuine relationship and that the most important stage was often someone's front porch or kitchen table. The rooftop, where this story began, the moment when Bruce appeared as an unexpected savior during community crisis, lived on in memory and metaphor. But the real salvation had come through sustained commitment to seeing each other's humanity and choosing to build something better together. Eleanor lived to be 91, spending her final years in the community she had helped create, surrounded by neighbors who had become family through intentional choice rather than biological accident. Margaret continued gardening until she was 87, teaching neighborhood children about plants and seasons while learning from them about music and technology. Bruce's songs from this period reflected the complexity and hope he had discovered through relationship with Eleanor and Margaret. The music was more mature, more grounded in real experience of community building, more honest about both the challenges and the possibilities of choosing to care for each other across differences of age, background, and circumstance. The legacy of that Tuesday morning fire extended far beyond property damage and insurance claims. It had sparked a reimagining of how people could live together, how crisis could become opportunity, and how strangers could become family through shared commitment to each other's well-being. In the end, the story was not about a famous musician rescuing elderly women from disaster. It was about what became possible when people chose to see beyond appearances, to act despite uncertainty, and to believe that community was not just something that happened to them, but something they could create together through daily choices to notice, to care, and to show up for each other when life demanded more than anyone could handle alone. The fire trucks had long since left Maple Street, but the warmth they had helped kindle, not through emergency response but through the human connections that crisis had made possible, continued to burn bright, lighting the way for others who were ready to discover that salvation often came not from above, but from the person standing right beside you, willing to share both the burden and the joy of building a life worth living. The transformative power of that single morning extended into dimensions that none of the participants could have imagined during those first chaotic hours when sirens filled the air and smoke clouded their vision. What had begun as an emergency response evolved into something far more profound, a reimagining of what it meant to age with dignity, to face life's challenges with support, and to discover that the most meaningful contributions often came in the later chapters of life rather than the earlier ones. Bruce's involvement with Eleanor and Margaret's project attracted attention from researchers studying aging and community development. Dr. Sarah Chen, a gerontologist from Rutgers University, visited their home to document their innovative approach to senior living and mutual support. Her subsequent research paper, titled Intentional Community as a Response to Social Isolation Among Older Adults, became widely cited in academic circles and policy discussions about aging in America. What we're seeing here, Dr. Chen explained during one of her interviews with Eleanor and Margaret, challenges fundamental assumptions about independence and dependence in later life. These women have created a model that maintains personal autonomy while providing the social connection and practical support that research shows are essential for healthy aging. The academic interest led to invitations for Eleanor and Margaret to speak at conferences about aging and community development. Initially hesitant to present themselves as experts, they gradually came to understand that their lived experience possessed a kind of wisdom that complemented formal research and policy analysis. Bruce often accompanied them to these speaking engagements, providing musical interludes, but also serving as a witness to the way their story resonated with audiences across different demographics and geographic regions. The themes they addressed, isolation, mutual support, reimagining life transitions as opportunities rather than losses, seemed to touch something universal in human experience. During a presentation at a senior center in Philadelphia, an elderly man in the audience stood up during the question period and said, "What you're describing sounds wonderful, but how do we get started when we don't have a famous musician to help us organize everything?" Eleanor's response revealed the depth of understanding she had developed about community building. "Sir, the famous musician didn't create what we have. He just happened to be present when we decided to stop being strangers to each other. The real work happened when Margaret and I chose to trust each other enough to be vulnerable, to admit we needed help, and to believe that we had something valuable to offer each other." Margaret nodded in agreement. "The fire was terrible, but it wasn't what saved us. What saved us was deciding that loneliness wasn't something we had to accept as inevitable. That decision, that's something anyone can make, regardless of their circumstances or resources." These conversations reinforced Bruce's growing conviction that his role in their story had been important, but not central. He had provided practical assistance and emotional support during a crucial period, but the vision and commitment that sustained their community came from Eleanor and Margaret themselves. This realization influenced his approach to other community development projects that he began supporting around the same time. Rather than positioning himself as the primary catalyst or leader, Bruce learned to identify and amplify the leadership that already existed within communities, providing resources and visibility for locally driven initiatives. One such project emerged in Camden, where Bruce had performed benefit concerts for years but had never engaged in sustained community development work. Working with local organizations, he helped establish a community center that combined senior services with youth programs, creating intergenerational connections similar to what he had witnessed between Eleanor and Margaret and their younger neighbors. The Camden Community Center became known for its innovative programming that paired older adults with teenagers and young adults around shared interests and mutual learning opportunities. Eleanor and Margaret served as consultants for the project, sharing lessons they had learned about creating meaningful connections across age differences. "What we discovered," Margaret explained to a group of Camden residents who were considering similar programming, "is that young people and older people often need the same things: to feel useful, to be heard, to contribute to something larger than themselves. When you create opportunities for those needs to be met through relationship with each other, remarkable things happen." The success of these initiatives attracted foundation funding and government attention. Bruce found himself testifying before congressional committees about community-based approaches to aging and social isolation, using Eleanor and Margaret's story to illustrate the potential for local solutions to address challenges that were typically viewed as requiring large-scale institutional interventions. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of their story was its influence on Bruce's artistic work during this period. The songs he wrote reflected a new understanding of heroism that centered on ordinary people making extraordinary commitments to each other's well-being over time. His album, Neighbors, released 3 years after the fire on Maple Street, included several songs directly inspired by his experience with Eleanor and Margaret. The title track told the story of two people who lived across the street from each other for decades without really connecting, until crisis forced them to choose between isolation and community. But the album's most powerful song was Small Fires, which used the metaphor of Eleanor and Margaret's kitchen fire to explore how disruption could become the catalyst for transformation. The lyrics spoke to anyone who had faced unexpected loss and had to decide whether to rebuild exactly what they had lost or to use the opportunity to create something better. The song's chorus became one of Bruce's most quoted lyrics. "Sometimes what looks like ending is really beginning. Sometimes what burns away was meant to go. Sometimes the smoke that blinds you clears the air for seeing what you never knew you needed to know." Small Fires resonated particularly strongly with audiences who were facing their own transitions. People dealing with divorce, job loss, health challenges, or the death of loved ones. The song provided a framework for understanding disruption as potential rather than just loss, for seeing crisis as an opportunity to examine what truly mattered and what could be released or transformed. Bruce's performances of the song often included stories about Eleanor and Margaret, though he was always careful to focus on their agency and wisdom rather than his own involvement. These stories became part of the song's meaning for audiences, providing concrete examples of how people could choose resilience and community even in the face of unexpected challenges. The ripple effects continued to expand in unexpected directions. A documentary filmmaker created a feature-length film about Eleanor and Margaret's community, following them through a full year of their shared life and exploring the model they had created for aging in community. Bruce served as executive producer, but insisted that the filmmaking be driven by the women's own perspectives rather than external interpretations of their story. The documentary, titled Building Home, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and later aired on public television. It sparked conversations about housing policy, aging services, and community development throughout the country. More importantly, it inspired similar projects in dozens of communities where people saw possibilities for creating their own versions of intentional community. Eleanor and Margaret began receiving letters from people around the world who were inspired by their example. A group of widowed women in Portland, Oregon, pooled their resources to buy a house they could share while maintaining separate living spaces. 3 couples in Austin, Texas, created a co-housing community designed around the principle of aging in place with mutual support. Each of these projects adapted Eleanor and Margaret's basic insights to local conditions and personal preferences, but all shared the core commitment to choosing community over isolation, mutual support over pure independence, and intentional relationship over casual neighborliness. Bruce documented many of these inspired projects, creating a loose network of communities that shared resources and best practices. He established a foundation that provided seed funding for similar initiatives, but the real work of community building continued to happen at the local level, driven by people who recognized their own needs and capacities in Eleanor and Margaret's story. As Eleanor entered her final years, she reflected often on the unexpected directions her life had taken after what had seemed like a routine Tuesday morning. The woman, who had spent decades as a quiet observer of neighborhood life, had become a recognized expert on community building and aging in place. "You know," she told Bruce during one of his visits as they sat in the garden that had become a neighborhood gathering place, "I used to think that the most important part of my life was behind me, that I was just marking time until the end. But these past few years have been some of the most meaningful of my entire life." She paused, watching a group of neighborhood children who were helping Margaret plant summer vegetables. "I think I understand now that usefulness doesn't end at a certain age. It just changes form. What I have to offer now is different from what I had to offer at 30 or 50, but it's not less valuable." Margaret, overhearing the conversation as she directed the children's planting efforts, added her own reflection. "What I've learned is that every loss creates space for something new to grow. When I lost my house to the fire, I thought I was losing everything that mattered. But what I actually lost was a bunch of stuff that was keeping me isolated from the things that really did matter." These conversations became part of the oral history project that Bruce initiated to document the stories of people who had created intentional communities in response to life transitions. The interviews revealed common themes across different ages, circumstances, and geographic regions. The importance of choice in how people structured their later lives, the power of intergenerational relationship, the value of combining independence with interdependence. But they also revealed the unique contributions that each community made to broader understanding of how people could live together with dignity and mutual support. Eleanor and Margaret's model influenced housing policy, inspired architectural innovations in senior living design, and provided a framework that other communities adapted to their own needs and preferences. The final chapter of Eleanor's life unfolded with the same dignity and intentionality that had characterized her community building work. When her health began to decline, she was able to remain in her own space while receiving support from Margaret, neighborhood volunteers, and professional caregivers who worked together to provide comprehensive care. Bruce visited regularly during this period, often bringing his guitar and playing quiet songs in the living room while Eleanor rested in her favorite chair. These intimate concerts became treasured memories for everyone who participated, moments when music served its most essential function of providing comfort and connection during difficult transitions. Eleanor's memorial service took place in the garden she and Margaret had created, with neighbors sharing stories about her influence on their lives and their community. Bruce performed small fires as part of the service, but the most moving moments came when ordinary community members spoke about the ways Eleanor had seen their potential and encouraged their contributions. Margaret continued living in their shared community for several more years, maintaining the garden and the regular gatherings that Eleanor had helped initiate. She became the keeper of their story, the person who could explain to visitors and researchers exactly how two strangers had become family and how their partnership had created something larger than either could have achieved alone. When Margaret eventually needed more intensive care than the community could provide, the transition was handled with the same thoughtfulness and dignity that had characterized all of their major decisions. She moved to a nearby assisted living facility, but maintained connections with the neighborhood and continued to serve as an inspiration for other communities exploring similar models. Bruce's final visit with Margaret took place in her new apartment, which she had decorated with photographs from the community they had built together. As they looked through albums of pictures from neighborhood gatherings, community meetings, and holiday celebrations, Margaret offered her own assessment of what they had accomplished. "Bruce," she said, her voice still clear despite her 90 years, "I want you to know that what we created together was exactly what I needed, even though I didn't know I needed it when we started. Sometimes the best things in life come from saying yes to possibilities you never would have imagined for yourself." She paused, looking at a photograph from their first housewarming celebration, when their vision for intentional community was still new and uncertain. "But I think what I'm most proud of is that we proved it's possible to choose how you want to live, regardless of your age or circumstances. We proved that community isn't something that just happens to you, it's something you can create." Those words became the foundation for Bruce's continued work supporting community development projects throughout the country. The lessons he had learned from Eleanor and Margaret about the importance of choice, the power of mutual support, the possibility of transformation even in later life, informed everything from his philanthropy to his artistic work. The foundation Bruce established in honor of Eleanor and Margaret continued their work long after both women had passed away. It provided funding and technical assistance for intentional communities, supported research on aging and community development, and created networks for sharing resources and best practices among similar projects. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was the simple demonstration that ordinary people facing ordinary challenges could choose extraordinary responses that created ripple effects far beyond their immediate circumstances. The fire on Maple Street had lasted only a few hours, but the community that emerged from its ashes continued to provide warmth and light for generations of people who discovered that they didn't have to face life's transitions alone. Years later, when Bruce was asked to identify the most important lesson he had learned from Eleanor and Margaret, his answer was always the same. "They taught me that heroism isn't about dramatic rescue or extraordinary talent. It's about showing up consistently, choosing community over comfort, and believing that every person has something valuable to contribute, regardless of their age or circumstances." The story continued to inspire new projects and innovations in community building, but its essential message remained constant: that the most profound transformations often began with the simplest decisions to see each other clearly, to respond to need with generosity, and to believe that together people could create something better than anything they could achieve alone. The rooftop where this story began, the metaphorical height from which Bruce had provided perspective and hope during crisis, became a symbol for the kind of leadership that elevates others rather than elevating itself. True heroism, Eleanor and Margaret had taught him, wasn't about being above the situation, but about being fully present within it, ready to work alongside others to build the kind of community where everyone could thrive. The impact of Eleanor and Margaret's story extended beyond individual communities to influence broader social movements and policy initiatives. Their model of intentional aging became part of academic curricula in social work programs, urban planning schools, and gerontology departments across the country. Students studied their approach as an example of how grassroots innovation could address systemic challenges in ways that traditional institutions had been unable to achieve. Professor Michael Torres at Columbia University's School of Social Work incorporated their story into his course on community practice with older adults. What Eleanor and Margaret demonstrated, he explained to his students, is that the expertise needed to solve problems often already exists within communities. The role of professionals isn't to impose solutions from outside, but to recognize and support the wisdom that emerges from lived experience. His students were required to conduct interviews with older adults in their own communities, exploring their experiences of isolation and connection, their needs for support, and their capacities to contribute. These assignments consistently revealed stories similar to Eleanor and Margaret's, people who had more to offer than they were being asked to give, who needed less rescuing and more recognition of their existing strengths. One student, Sarah Martinez, discovered that her grandmother's apartment building was full of isolated older adults who barely knew each other despite living in close proximity for years. Inspired by Eleanor and Margaret's example, she organized a series of community dinners in the building's common room, creating opportunities for neighbors to share skills, resources, and companionship. What started as a class assignment, Sarah later reflected, became the foundation for transforming how an entire building functioned as a community. My grandmother went from being lonely and disconnected to being the unofficial coordinator of a mutual support network that included everyone from recent immigrants to long-time residents. These ripple effects multiplied as students graduated and carried the lessons of intentional community into their professional practice. Social workers began approaching their work with older adults differently, focusing more on facilitating connections and less on providing services. Urban planners started incorporating principles of age-friendly community design that emphasized social interaction and mutual support. The influence extended into unexpected areas as well. Architects studying Eleanor and Margaret's home modifications developed new approaches to accessory dwelling units that prioritized community building alongside affordable housing. Their innovations were featured in design magazines and professional conferences, spreading practical knowledge about how physical spaces could support social connection. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, an architect specializing in housing for older adults, visited Eleanor and Margaret's community multiple times to understand how their physical environment supported their social goals. What they created, she observed, wasn't just about putting two living units on one property. It was about designing spaces that naturally encouraged interaction while still preserving privacy and independence. Her subsequent projects incorporated lessons learned from their model, shared gardens that required cooperation to maintain, common areas positioned to facilitate casual encounters, and private spaces designed to open onto community spaces when residents chose connection over solitude. These design innovations influenced municipal housing policies in several cities, where officials recognized that supporting aging in place required more than just accessible bathrooms and ramp access. It required communities designed to combat isolation and support the kinds of relationships that Eleanor and Margaret had discovered were essential for well-being in later life. Bruce found himself consulting on some of these policy initiatives, sharing insights from his years of observing Eleanor and Margaret's community in action. His testimony before city councils and planning commissions carried weight not because of his celebrity status, but because of his detailed knowledge of how their model actually functioned in daily practice. Policymakers often focus on the big dramatic interventions, Bruce explained to a housing committee in Newark. But what Eleanor and Margaret taught me is that the most important changes happen in the small daily choices. Whether to knock on a neighbor's door, whether to offer help with grocery shopping, whether to invite someone to share a meal. The question for policy is how to create conditions where those choices become easier and more natural. The Newark Committee implemented several recommendations based on Bruce's testimony, including zoning changes that made it easier for property owners to create accessory dwelling units, funding for community gardens in neighborhoods with high concentrations of older adults, and support for neighborhood-based mutual aid organizations. But perhaps the most significant policy impact came through the work of Congressman David Rivera, who had heard Eleanor speak at a conference on aging and had been deeply moved by her insights about the relationship between housing and community. Rivera introduced federal legislation that would provide tax incentives for property owners who created accessory dwelling units specifically designed to support aging in place with community connection. The legislation, known as the Eleanor Mitchell Community Housing Act, passed with bipartisan support after Eleanor herself testified before Congress during her final year of life. Her testimony, delivered from a wheelchair but with her characteristic clarity and dignity, focused on the economic and social benefits of enabling people to age in community rather than in institutional settings. "Honorable representatives," Eleanor said during her testimony, "what Margaret and I discovered is not complicated or expensive to replicate. It requires changing how we think about independence and dependence, about privacy and community, about what it means to grow older with dignity and purpose. The investment required is minimal compared to the cost of institutional care. But more importantly, it preserves what people value most: their autonomy, their relationships, and their ability to contribute meaningfully to community life." The legislation provided the framework for thousands of similar projects across the country, but Eleanor's testimony also influenced the broader national conversation about aging and community. Her words were quoted in editorial pages, shared on social media, and referenced in academic papers exploring alternatives to traditional approaches to senior care. Bruce was present in the congressional hearing room when Eleanor delivered her testimony, sitting in the gallery and watching as this woman, who had once been a quiet observer of neighborhood life, commanded the attention of national lawmakers with her wisdom about community and mutual support. After the hearing, Eleanor approached Bruce with tears in her eyes. "You know," she said quietly, "when I was sitting in my living room that Tuesday morning, watching you walk down the street, I never imagined that our story would reach this far. But I think Robert would be proud that something good came from the worst day of Margaret's life." The federal legislation catalyzed state and local initiatives that expanded access to the kinds of communities that Eleanor and Margaret had pioneered. Housing authorities began incorporating their principles into senior housing developments, creating spaces that combined private living areas with extensive common areas designed for community activities and mutual support. Faith communities, inspired by the role that Mount Olive Baptist Church had played in Eleanor and Margaret's story, began exploring how their properties could be used to support similar initiatives. Several churches created accessory dwelling units on their grounds, specifically for older adults who wanted to age in community while contributing their skills and experience to congregational life. The model proved adaptable across different religious traditions and cultural contexts. A synagogue in Chicago created a community garden and tiny house village for older adults who wanted to downsize their living spaces while maintaining connections to their spiritual community. A mosque in Detroit established a cooperative housing project that enabled older immigrants to live near their extended families while maintaining their independence. Buddhist meditation centers, Unitarian Universalist congregations, and even secular community centers began exploring how their facilities could support aging in community models inspired by Eleanor and Margaret's example. Each adaptation reflected the specific values and needs of its community while maintaining the core principles of mutual support and intentional relationship. Bruce documented many of these faith-based initiatives, interviewing participants about their experiences and incorporating their stories into his ongoing musical exploration of community and spirituality. The songs that emerged from these conversations reflected a deep understanding of how people's relationships with the sacred were often expressed through their relationships with each other. His song, "Sacred Ground," told the story of a woman who found her deepest spiritual experiences not in traditional worship services, but in the daily practice of caring for neighbors who had become chosen family. The lyrics explored how community itself could become a form of prayer, how showing up for each other could become a way of honoring whatever people held most sacred. When the temple is wherever you are, when the altar is your neighbor's door, when the offering is your presence and your time, that's when you know what sacred's for, went the chorus, capturing the theological insight that Eleanor and Margaret's example had provided for communities of faith exploring new approaches to spiritual practice and social responsibility. The song resonated particularly strongly with older adults who had experienced disconnection from traditional religious institutions, but still sought ways to express their spiritual values through community engagement. Many reported that the song helped them articulate their own experiences of finding the sacred in everyday acts of mutual care and support. Bruce's concert performances of Sacred Ground often included stories about specific faith communities that had been inspired by Eleanor and Margaret's model. These stories served to normalize the idea that spiritual life and community life were deeply interconnected, that people could express their deepest values through the practical work of creating supportive relationships with neighbors. The influence extended into secular contexts as well, as community centers, libraries, and other public institutions began exploring how their facilities could support aging in community initiatives. The Oakland Public Library System created a program called Neighbors in Residence that provided temporary housing for older adults in library buildings while they searched for permanent community living arrangements. The program was inspired directly by Eleanor and Margaret's story, with librarians who had seen the documentary Building Home recognizing that their institutions could play a role in addressing social isolation among older adults. Participants in the program received not just housing, but also access to the library's educational and cultural programming, creating opportunities for continued learning and community engagement. Similar programs emerged in community centers across the country, with recreation departments and senior services agencies collaborating to create temporary and permanent housing options that prioritized community connection alongside basic shelter. These initiatives demonstrated that the principles Eleanor and Margaret had discovered could be scaled and adapted to serve larger populations while maintaining their essential focus on relationship and mutual support. The success of these programs attracted international attention, with delegations from countries facing their own challenges, with aging populations visiting Eleanor and Margaret's original community to study their model. Representatives from Japan, Denmark, Germany, and Australia all made pilgrimages to Maple Street to understand how American approaches to aging in community might be adapted to their own cultural contexts. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, a researcher from Tokyo University studying social isolation among older adults in Japan, spent a week living in Eleanor and Margaret's community during the final year of Eleanor's life. His observations about the cultural transferability of their model were published in international journals and influenced policy discussions in several countries. What struck me most, Dr. Tanaka wrote in his research report, was not the specific structures or programs they had created, but the underlying philosophy of seeing older adults as resources rather than burdens, as contributors rather than just care recipients. This perspective shift seems to be the key element that could be adapted across different cultural contexts. His work led to pilot projects in several Japanese cities, where older adults were encouraged to form intentional communities that combined traditional Japanese values of family and community responsibility with innovative approaches to housing and mutual support. These projects became models for other Asian countries facing similar demographic transitions. European researchers were particularly interested in how Eleanor and Margaret's model addressed the balance between individual autonomy and community support, values that were central to European social democratic traditions, but challenging to implement in practice for aging populations. Several Scandinavian countries experimented with co-housing projects specifically designed for older adults that incorporated lessons learned from the American experience. The international exchange of ideas created a global network of communities exploring similar approaches to aging in community, with Eleanor and Margaret's original project serving as a touchstone for conversations about cultural adaptation and local innovation. Bruce found himself traveling internationally to perform at conferences and community gatherings where people were working to create their own versions of intentional community. During a concert in Copenhagen, at a conference on aging and community, Bruce reflected on the global reach of a story that had begun with two elderly women choosing to support each other after a house fire. Eleanor and Margaret probably never imagined that their decision to become neighbors instead of strangers would inspire people around the world, he told the audience. But that's the thing about genuine community. It creates ripple effects that extend far beyond anything the original participants could have predicted. The Copenhagen conference resulted in a formal international network of aging in community initiatives, with Eleanor and Margaret's project recognized as a founding model for the global movement. The network facilitated sharing of resources, best practices and research findings among projects in dozens of countries, creating a knowledge base that continued to grow and evolve. Bruce served on the advisory board of this international network, using his platform to raise awareness about aging in community initiatives and to connect communities with resources for developing their own projects. His foundation provided seed funding for innovative projects in countries where such initiatives were just beginning to emerge. But he always emphasized that the real work happened at the local level, among people who recognized their own needs and capacities in Eleanor and Margaret's example. The international recognition was meaningful, but the daily practice of choosing community over isolation, support over independence, and relationship over convenience, that was where transformation actually occurred. The story continued to evolve even after both Eleanor and Margaret had passed away. The house on Maple Street became a kind of pilgrimage site for people interested in aging in community, with new residents who maintained the gardens and continued the traditions of regular community gatherings and mutual support. The current residents, a couple in their 70s who had been inspired by Eleanor and Margaret's example to sell their large suburban home and move into intentional community, served as informal guides for visitors who wanted to understand how the model actually functioned in practice. They maintained extensive photo albums and oral history recordings that documented the evolution of the community from its beginning through its ongoing development. These materials became part of a digital archive that Bruce helped establish, creating a resource for researchers, policymakers, and community organizers who wanted to understand the practical details of how intentional aging communities could be created and sustained over time. The archive included not just documentation of successes, but also honest accounts of challenges and failures, moments when the community model had been tested by illness, conflict, or external pressures. These materials provided realistic guidance for other communities that were beginning their own experiments in aging together. The legacy extended through the many professionals whose careers had been influenced by exposure to Eleanor and Margaret's story. Social workers, architects, policymakers, researchers, and community organizers carried forward the insights they had gained from studying or visiting the Maple Street community, influencing their work with other populations and in other contexts. Bruce's own artistic legacy was deeply marked by his years of involvement with Eleanor and Margaret's community. The songs, concerts and interviews from this period reflected a maturity and depth that critics and fans recognized as representing a new phase in his artistic development. His album, Community, was nominated for multiple Grammy Awards and was widely recognized as one of his most important works. But Bruce always insisted that the real achievement belonged to Eleanor and Margaret, and the countless other people who had chosen to create communities of mutual support and shared responsibility. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of community and the importance of showing up for each other, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your own stories of unexpected connection and mutual support in the comments below. Together, we can create the kind of communities we all deserve to live in.